Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation about HBO's upcoming docuseries, The Lady in the Dale, with the incredible Zackary Drucker. Zackary is an independent artist, a filmmaker, and a cultural producer. She has performed and exhibited her work internationally in museums, galleries, and film festivals. Zackary is also an Emmy-nominated producer for the docuseries This Is Me, and was a producer on the Golden Globe and Emmy Award-winning Amazon show Transparent. Before we begin the conversation today, let's take a quick look at a trailer for The Lady in the Dale.
Henry Ford said, you catch things on the rising tide, you're doomed to success.
She wanted to be known as a trailblazer. As any good criminal, she was thinking several moves ahead.
America in the early 70s, anybody could be anything they wanted to be. I got a mother of five who's invented a car. Is she famous? No, but she's going to be.
I'm going to knock the hell out of Detroit.
She thought that she would be the next Henry Ford.
It's a situation of David fighting Goliath.
She was afraid of spies from the big three.
There was a briefcase full of cash, and next to it, the .357 Magnum revolver.
It was a house of cards.
Law enforcement agencies started taking a closer look, and the press turned on her and said, this is a scam.
When they couldn't decide if the car was real or not, they started focusing on Liz. She was on trial as a trans person.
When the police started swarming in the house, they got her because she came back to say goodbye to her kids.
She was ahead of her time. She knew the pain.
She took it upon herself to defend herself in front of the jury. This is a woman who knew how to inspire.
She was one of those people that could sell anything.
The defendant has been charged with a plot to murder some of the witnesses.
It was just crazy. Someone started shooting.
This person was totally unknown until she showed up in Los Angeles promoting a three-wheel car. Who the hell was she? People need a hero. That's what America's all about.
Dun, dun, dun.
Da, da, da. Welcome, Zackary. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Alphonso. I'm thrilled to have this conversation with you. I've been looking forward to it all day.
Yes, I am too. So let's get started. Zackary, first, I want to just say what a joy it is to be here with you talking about this docuseries. I remember seeing an interview of you talking about another powerful film, Disclosure, for which you were the creative or a creative consultant. You talked about how any attempt to understand our history makes us stronger in the present. Now you're making a directorial debut in The Lady in the Dale, which premieres on January 31st on HBO. Can you please tell folks a little bit about Liz Carmichael and why the story you are telling in this series is so important to us today?
Yep, absolutely. Liz Carmichael was an entrepreneur who in the mid-70s popped up in Los Angeles to sell options on an energy-efficient three-wheeled car called the Dale at the height of the oil crisis, with lines around the block, people waiting to get gasoline for hours. It was a cultural moment, you know, similar to today in many ways, with anxiety kind of, pervasive in society. Liz came along at the right moment and seized the moment and put herself out there. But she had a complicated past and was, in fact, a felon on the run and had transitioned on the run in the 1960s from male to female. And the, law caught up with her eventually. And our 4-part series kind of unravels the wild and bombastic tale of Liz Carmichael. And I think Liz's story is such a precursor to themes that continue to impact impact us today and reverberate through time. it's been challenging to talk about the series without giving away too many of the twists and turns that come in at the very end. But, you know, I think the story of Liz Carmichael offers a key to understanding the origins of trans people being maligned in the media, their identities being called into question. And then, of course, we get into the longer history and scope of trans people being publicly humiliated, both in the press and in their communities of origin.
You participate in a profession that I revere. I love film. I love filmmaking, as you can see from my background there, from Almodovar to Wong Kar-wai to Uzma and Ben.
Wong Kar-wai is one of my favorite directors of all time.
Wong Kar-wai.
And Almodovar, forget about it. Almodovar is like the ultimate for me.
And
you just named two of my favorite filmmakers. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, we could go on all day, right? We could talk about all these filmmakers that really are able to take an experience, put it on film, and transport us to another space. And I love complicated stories, but I only like complicated stories when they're done well. One thing that was particularly clear to me in watching this docuseries is the role that you played in telling Liz's story so responsibly, especially when discrimination and violence against trans people, trans women particularly, is so tied up in stigma and accusations of deceit. So how did you deal with this construct and present it so authentically on film? Can you talk about how you navigated some of these nuances as a filmmaker as well as an advocate?
Wow. I mean, it was really like trying to pull apart a tangled ball of yarn for a year and a half. And there was so many layers to the story to unravel. Liz's story is, gosh, what was your question again? I'm sorry.
My question to put a finer point on it, you had someone in this docuseries who sort of dealt in lies, but not when it came to her authenticity as a woman. And so you had this juxtaposition that you had to present on film. And I want to sort of extrapolate from you both as a filmmaker as well as an advocate. How did you sort of navigate that terrain to make sure that you are presenting Liz authentically, but also presenting Liz based on the facts, based on the fact that she actually manipulated people for much of her life?
I will start from the beginning with my answer. I think that Liz in her day, as a trans woman, her identity was conflated with her history as a criminal. And, throughout time, trans women in particular have been conveyed as evil deceivers and make-believers, as Susan Stryker so eloquently states in our docuseries. Regardless of a person's criminality, trans, folks were always kind of made an example of as a fraudulent identity, as impersonating, the cross-sex, opposite sex, as it were. And as a filmmaker, I came to this in 2019, this project. Jay Duplass called me and said, "Have you ever heard of Liz Carmichael?" I had not. And my instinct, honestly, was like, well, why this story? There's so many good stories of trans and gender expansive people throughout history. And I'm glad that I started there, honestly, because I had so much to learn about through Liz, honestly, and through understanding her story better. And I worked with a co-director, Nick Camilleri, who'd been obsessed with this story for a decade and had kind of gathered all of the information. So I came in 2019 and started to put it together with the creative nucleus of Duplass Brothers Productions, another lead producer, Elena Carruthers, and our lead editor. And we started to kind of figure out how to tell Liz's story in the first 45 years of her life. So she transitions late in life, not unlike many other trans folks who are in heterosexual partnerships with kids. Liz kind of follows that model. And at 45 in the 1960s, starts to realize that she can do something about her gender dysphoria. With Christine Jorgensen coming out in the 50s, I think Liz was trying to figure herself out. A byproduct of her transitioning was that the FBI, who had put a tremendous amount of resources into trying to track her, lost her trail because they didn't have it in their imagination that the person they were looking for, Geraldine Michael, Liz's dead name, was in fact also Liz Carmichael. They were actually still following Liz's wife. And in the FBI, I was listing like, Vivian lives with Elizabeth Carmichael. We can't find any information about her. They just couldn't put it together that Liz was the person they were looking for. And therefore, all of this to say that her identity as a fraudulent person was kind of conflated with her transness, and all of the kind of criminal past that she had. In the series, we tried to separate it. So we established Liz in the 45 years of her life. We say she transitioned. She eventually found this car to market. And then in the second episode, we don't mention her transness at all. We actually just let it kind of naturalize into the viewer's understanding of who she is. So it's like people stop thinking, oh, this is a trans person. Like it's not out of the ordinary to you. And then in the third episode, shit hits the fan. Pardon my friend, but she has an epic downfall, and of course, due to largely her identity as a trans woman. And it's a wild story. There's something in Liz's story, I think, for everybody to learn.
I mean, you did such a fantastic job. I've never watched a docuseries where you utilize so many really interesting tools to tell the story, right? I mean, the stick figures that you use are the photos where you were using photos from the past to really tell the story of the present. So that's a slight detour, but I just want to say you did a fantastic job in
Thank you.
Using old footage to really tell a story in a very compelling way. And in this docuseries, just to continue this thread that we've been talking about, sort of the line between being a filmmaker and an advocate at the same time, there are a lot of things that Liz experienced in the 1970s and the 1980s that transgender people are still facing today. It's compounded even more so, right, by sexism and racism. So from bias and discrimination in the workplace to the horrors that many transgender people face in the criminal justice system. What I'm interested in from your perspective is, where do you see the greatest similarities with what Liz experienced then and today? And from your perspective, what do you think are some of the greatest areas of progress that we've seen over the past few years?
Wow. I feel like the future is both better and worse simultaneously in so many areas of society, and that progress moves alongside opposition. Liz is such a microcosm of what today has become a global conversation around trans folks existing in public life. And, just to start from the beginning, I would say themes that continue to reverberate. Liz, access to trans healthcare being divided along class lines, having to kind of transition without doctors and without access to hormones. I think that, trans healthcare is becoming a checkerboard from state to state of, you know, obstacles for folks in most of the states in America. Employment discrimination impacted Liz's life, and that continues to be, I think, one of the largest impediments for trans and non-binary people to gain a foothold in advanced capitalism, this crazy system we're trying to all survive at this point. Liz's incarceration, you know, Liz was incarcerated twice, and, you know, we know that trans folks of color are disproportionately incarcerated and, you know, forced to eke out an existence by surviving off of the underground economy. I think that, and then again, you know, I think the biggest takeaway is just the ways in which trans people's identities are called into question in the media. And the series points to one particular Fox News pundit. In the end, it's one of the spoilers, so I'm not going to give away for anyone who has not seen the series. But, you know, his words are, you know, this particular commentator has made it one of his hallmark issues. It's an anti-trans platform. And, you know, of course, the apple doesn't fall from the tree. This person is, you know, this person's father had a stake in publicly pillaring Liz Carmichael. So, I mean, yeah, I think that Liz's story is so prescient today, and for other reasons too, beyond her transness. I think that we are looking very clearly at a culture that has rewarded narcissism and pandered to the kind of cult of personality that was really born in the 1970s, that produced Liz and produced other public figures who are well known, and produced a lot of also grandiose, self-aggrandizing entrepreneurs in tech today, also whom are well known and often in the press. So this is kind of like a humble origin story that unlocks, I think, a lot of meaning and kind of cultural themes that continue to impact us today.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really great point that you just made, because notwithstanding the title of this docuseries, your work here, your work on this film is not only about Liz Carmichael. For example, Susan Stryker, who has done so much to uncover the history of transgender people in this country, she provides exceptional context throughout the series. One especially striking story that she tells is, and I hope I'm not giving this away too much, but she tells the story around the laws that criminalized wearing clothes traditionally associated with another gender, right? She recounts the story of Frances Thompson. If folks who don't know who Frances Thompson is, Frances Thompson is a formerly enslaved Black woman, believed to be the first transgender woman to testify before Congress about the Memphis riots in 1866. So the riots lasted for days, and Thompson's house was attacked by white terrorists. She was raped. She bravely testified in front of Congress, but years later, she was arrested for so-called cross-dressing, and her testimony was discredited because conservatives really weaponized her trans identity. So the story that you're telling here is just one of so many stories told throughout the series that really underscore how little queer history we know, and especially trans history. So as a storyteller, again, and as a filmmaker, can you talk a little bit about what this film means to you and the impact that it could have in terms of helping us learn about our history?
Absolutely. I mean, thank you for highlighting Frances Thompson's story as well. Susan has done a lot of proprietary research on Frances Thompson, and it was, I think, such a anchoring moment in the last episode to kind of explore her history and its connection to Liz. I mean, Susan, also found in reviewing these articles from the 1870s of Francis Thompson that it was pivotal. Francis Thompson's case was pivotal in dismantling radical Reconstruction in that election of 1876, and that the way in which her identity as a trans woman was weaponized was used specifically as a way to embarrass the pro-radical Reconstruction Republicans at the time. And it worked. They lost that election. Francis Thompson was the kind of trans boogeyman of that particular election. We did there was a very long version of that history capsule in the last episode. And ultimately we realized this is the next project. This has got to be, Francis Thompson needs her own limited series. Basically, it needs to be a period piece.
Are you making an announcement here about the next project you're doing?
I'm putting it out into the world. It's got to happen. Francis Thompson is banging on Earth's door for her story to be told, like Liz was. And I really do feel like Liz's story was really dragged through the mud, and was not told accurately or justly in her own lifetime. I think understanding Francis Thompson, Lucy Hicks Anderson, Liz, all three of whom you can find no administrative trace of, no birth certificates, no death certificates. Lucy Hicks Anderson was a pillar in her community in Oxnard, California, before she was outed and incarcerated in the mid-1940s. Community leader. You can't find a single document in the city of Oxnard with Lucy Hicks Anderson's name on it. And so there is this way that local administrators literally erase the existence of trans people because presumably they're an embarrassment to the status quo. And I think also the assertion that Liz was a man masquerading as a woman was ultimately so pervasive and so confusing that she is not included in trans history. I didn't know anything about her going into this. And I don't think that was an accident. I think that was somewhat by design. In understanding Francis Thompson and Lucy Hicks Anderson's treatment by the judicial system, by law enforcement, it's no surprise how Liz is treated in the 1970s. It's sort of hard to imagine it going any other way. And then again, also in the last episode, we do point to the incredibly rich history of trans women of color in the streets. Marsha P. Johnson, Raquel Willis today, trans people contesting their identities in the court of public opinion, like Carolyn Coffey in the 1990s. We try to kind of situate Liz in a larger community that she may not have been actually connected to in her lifetime, but that she is connected to in the celestial realm and in the cultural realm. And, I think that our ancestors are both people that we know, people that we are literal descendants of, and people that we don't know, people whose names we will never know, but are touching us nonetheless.
Well, thank you for telling this story. It is an important story for people to hear and put it in appropriate context. Now I have one more question for you before we let you go. So yeah. I want to talk a little bit about politics or political issues. We saw enormous gains, as you know, under President Obama, and then some deeply immoral setbacks under President Trump. Now, in a week or so, President Biden, Vice President Harris, and their administration have advanced equality, advanced the most substantive, wide-ranging LGBTQ executive order in history, overturned the Trump's discriminatory ban on transgender people serving in the US military, and the list goes on. But these executive orders, as great as they are, we still have a lot of work to do. For example, we have to pass the Equality Act, which would provide comprehensive legal protections to LGBTQ people. We are also seeing deep backlash in state houses. We're seeing an onslaught of legislation targeting transgender youth specifically. And this backlash is fueled by anti-trans stigma and anti-trans bias, or lies, I should say. There's so much misunderstanding out there today. My question for you, my last question for you is, what do you think is the media's role in helping to combat misinformation that we are seeing out there today?
It's $1 million question. And there's so much in your question to respond. My head is going in a million different places, honestly. I think the last several years were so demoralizing and worrisome. And, I think that we are all traumatized, honestly, by it. But luckily, we're tough cookies. Luckily, we have this, legacy of resilience and survival at all costs. And I think that no matter who legislates against us, no matter who locks us up or silences us or takes our lives, nobody can stop us from being born into the world. We will continue to exist. We will persist through time. We are a part of a lineage that is just, miraculously survival, and I draw, so much strength from these stories of trans resilience. I think knowing what our predecessors had to go through for us to get here is both staggering and gives a little bit of perspective that, what we go through quietly, privately, in our own rooms, isolated during COVID, is maybe a lot less scary than being dragged into the public square and publicly whipped, in the case of Charles Hamilton, whose story we also get into in the last episode. And I think rely on that agility and that ability to kind of survive, to know when you're in imminent danger. And I think that young people, young trans folks specifically, are, becoming a kind of symbol, a kind of cultural nugget to fight over, and it's an abomination, truly. And yet, I know too that so many trans folks, myself included, were not able to manifest our transness in adolescence, and were ostracized and bullied and made examples of. And, I think that having that experience, having come of age in the 80s and 90s, gave me thick skin. So yeah, I would say to all the young people and all the parents of young people out there that no conditions are impossible, that all of these obstacles are surmountable, and that the moral arc of the universe bends towards justice, in the words of Martin Luther King Jr. And we're touching each other through time, and we are a part of that arc. I so grateful for the many leaders in our community who are fighting and pushing us towards liberation. And it's a gift to be a part of that movement.
Oh, thank you. Call to action for all people to engage in fighting against disinformation. Hope all of you know that the Human Rights Campaign is actively involved in state houses all across the country to make sure that we defeat anti-LGBTQ bills, we defeat anti-LGBTQ policies, and all of us have an active role to play in this process. Zackary, I just want to thank you so much for joining us today. It has been such a pleasure. And I want to say to folks who are watching, please tune in January 31st on HBO Max to watch Zackary's new docuseries. I saw it. I think it's great. It's compelling. It is so incredibly interesting. And you will be riveted to the scene, to the screen. I was, at least. I had to sort of stop it just to, get back to work. But I hope that all of you will take some time to watch the docuseries. It is an important part of our history. And Zackary does a brilliant, beautiful job in communicating this story and getting us to actually digest it and process it for today. It's important for us to understand our history, and this is a huge part of it. Zackary, once again, thank you for everything.
Thank you so much, Alphonso. Thank you, HRC. Thrilled to be part of this.